Call to order the November 10th, 2022 meeting of the Tillamook County Planning Commission. The first order of business is a roll call. We'll start with those of us who are here.
Chad Allen.
Gail Uzel, I'll be chairing tonight.
Megan Gillis.
You need to unmute yourself, Mark.
Thank you. Mark Roberts.
Kai Sievert.
All right, thank you. All right, on the agenda tonight, we have old business, a continuation, and that's 851-22000-328 PLNG, which is a conditional use, and 851-22000-329 PLNG, which is a development permit. This is a consolidated review of estuary floodplain development permit and conditional use request for a wetland restoration project. The subject property is zoned Estuary Natural, EN, and Estuary Conservation 1, EC1, and Farm, F1, is partially located within the Shoreland Overlay Zone and lies entirely within the Flood Hazard Overlay Zone. The subject property is located to the west of Highway 101 and is designated as tax lots 901, 1700, and 1900 in Section 12 of Township 1 South, Range 10 West of the Willamette Meridian, Tillamook County, Oregon. The applicant and property owners are the Nature Conservancy. As I said, this is a continuation, but I'm going to go ahead and read the stuff that's required here anyway. We don't have copies of the criteria here tonight, but we can post them if we need them on the board, on the screen up here. The following are required by ORS 197763. Testimony and evidence must be directed toward the criteria, if applicable, or other criteria in the plan or land use regulations which the person testifying believes to apply to the decision. Failure to raise an issue with sufficient specificity to afford us and other interested persons an opportunity to respond to the issue precludes appeal to LUBA on that issue. Failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues relating to proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow Tillamook County or its designate to respond to the issue precludes an action for damages in circuit court pursuant to ORS Chapter 197. We're having a continuance, so I don't need to read that part of it. We've already had the staff report and chance for commissioners to ask questions of staff. We've had the applicant's presentation, and we've had public comments. Then we left the record open for some written comments and rebuttals, and have received those in our packet, and I believe there's nothing else other than what we've received. So does staff have any further comments at this point?
I do, Madam Chair, thank you. Probably it would be prudent though if you read the questions for Planning Commission members.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine.
Turn the
Thank
paper
you.
over, is that what you mean? And incidentally, after the further comments from staff, then the hearing has already been closed, will be closed to all testimony. Then the commission may discuss the issue amongst ourselves. We will then either make a decision at that time or continue the public hearing until a specified time, or take the matter under advisement and announce a recommendation at a specified time. Is there a challenge to the jurisdiction of the Tillamook County Planning Commission to hear this matter? If so, please state the challenge at this time. Are there any conflicts of interest or personal biases to be declared by a commission member? If so, please state the bias or conflict at this time. Have there been any ex parte contacts regarding the upcoming matter that a board member needs to declare? If so, please state the ex parte contacts at this time. All right.
Thank Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you for the
evening.
prompt.
For the record, my name is Sarah Absher. I'm the Director of the Tillamook County Department of Community Development. I do have a few closing comments. These are largely focused on questions that were raised at the last hearing that I promised to come back with a couple of answers. And then also I did receive a few questions from Commissioner Sievert in an email. They're excellent questions, so I'm prepared to also share those with the commission as a whole this evening. So first, I'm going to address Commissioner Sievert's questions with the feedback I received from FEMA. This would also relate to the draft conditions of approval that were included in your packet should the commission choose to approve this request. So in my conversation with Mitch Payne, Mitch is the Mitigation Division Floodplain Management Specialist for FEMA Region 10, which is the FEMA district that we belong to. He confirmed that a letter of map revision is not required for this project and that base flood elevations would also not have to be reestablished as part of this project. And that is largely because this area is tidally influenced. So with that, I believe that answers a couple of Commissioner Sievert's questions, and with that, there is no rise analysis required for this property because it is not in a regulatory floodway. As far as the no rise requirement pertaining to estuary zones, the zones themselves do not determine whether or not a no rise is required. It is the actual map boundary of the floodway that the flood hazard ordinance specifically states that no rise is required. Adjacent properties, so there's a question about what are adjacent properties, how is that defined? It is the properties that are bordering the project area and the subject property. With respect to concerns raised about development in the estuary causing flooding concerns and I would say tidal changes in relation to low tide. With respect to FEMA, that is something that they were aware of. So when we look at the letter of map revision, the no rise analysis or base flood elevation reestablishments, Mr. Payne did confirm that those studies would not be required for this project. In relation to questions about active versus passive restoration, so Commissioner Sievert also correctly identified that passive restoration activities are permitted in the estuary zone, but it didn't say anything necessarily about active restoration activities. So looking closer in the comprehensive plan, there are a few sections that address passive versus active restoration activities in estuary zones, in all of the estuary zones. And in the estuary natural zone, the long and short of it is that if it's for salmonid habitat restoration, water quality, significant biological or wetland habitat enhancements, it's allowed. It can be allowed. Obviously, that was the zone that triggered the conditional use review requirement. But in my opinion, those active restoration efforts are consistent with those policy provisions that would or could potentially allow active restoration in estuary natural zones, given the management units for this area, and you do have copies of those and they are in the record, that the active restoration activities would be consistent with the needs and what is significant about those estuary management units. So did include, as I'd mentioned, a draft list of conditions of approval. Happy to go through those later if it's appropriate with you. And again, obviously, based on this information shared tonight, a couple of those may need to be revised anyway. So that is all I have.
Madam Chair, may I ask a question, staff?
Go ahead, Commissioner Sievert.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah, for clarifying those FEMA things. And I think even given that one of the conditions is approval from all the agencies, that would require FEMA approval anyways. But my question the only question remaining deals with adjacent properties. We heard in testimony at the previous hearing that the property east of 101 was being claimed to be, was flooding, and the claim was that some of the flooding was being caused by the restoration activities. And I think my question is, are properties east of 101 considered adjacent, or, and I think it's some other language we use in the ordinances, we talk about in the vicinity, and I don't know if that's too broad, but, so my question is, are those properties upstream, east of 101, considered adjacent?
Thank you, Commissioner Sievert. So the properties are considered, they're in the vicinity. Adjacent typically is referred to and defined as something that is next to.
Right.
But I think that what is important in context of what is before you today is the fact that it is understood that floodplains are vast. So when we look at impacts or potential impacts for development in floodplains, those impacts can extend beyond adjacent properties. So I do think that is something that adjacent or within the vicinity, which I think in context of the flood hazard overlay zone and the floodplain could be within that flood basin. The development permit review criteria for a floodplain development permit, what it asks for is consideration of whether or not the development activity, which includes fill, so that would be whether, you know, kind of like the Department of State Lands, whether you're bringing it in, bringing it out, or shifting it around, does not impede or alter drainage or the flow of flood water. And in this instance, there are components of this project that could alter those, you know, that could alter drainage, could alter the course. And you do have the hydrology studies that discuss that.
So then my question, I understand, you know, the criteria in terms of allowing them to develop their, so my question then is, if there is, let's say there is damage to the property east of 101 to that, as was at least testified to in a previous hearing, that damage was to his barn, flooding in his barn. If there was such damage, would the conditions offered by staff require the applicant to restore or help repair that damage?
So some of that is largely going to be a civil matter. The monitoring is something that, so in the provisions of the collaborative process and this review process, in the spirit of Senate Bill 1517 and the conditional use review process, there is language that allows for conditions of approval to be made that capture the collaborative process, the needs, and what was agreed upon. With that in the record, the applicants actually laid out more recent developments in continuing that collaborative process, or their attempt and efforts to, with adjacent landowners, right? So we're talking about properties, but I think it's fair to say adjacent landowners who own several of those properties that ultimately extend east of Highway 101, that they on their own, that the Nature Conservancy, the applicant and owner on their own accord are continuing to try to work with the adjacent landowners to better assess and respond to any impacts that may occur.
So then, I understand and certainly appreciate the collaborative process. And so is it in staff's mind clear that particular condition of approval, is it clear that the county is not responsible for enforcing it? I mean, I appreciate the fact that it's part of an agreement, collaborative agreement, and I appreciate it's a civil matter, but I didn't want to put the county in a position where if some damage were done and restoration was being asked for, would the county be required to enforce that?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I appreciate that. I think so you're referring specifically to recommended condition of approval number 5, is that correct?
Right.
So what the requirement is that a copy of their management plan be provided to the department, but it doesn't require the department to assess whether or not those actions and mitigation are, like, we don't have to approve them. I think it's more of something on file that provides that access and resource to the public to where, you know, those mitigation measures have been thought out, they're codified in a plan, and that plan is on file with the department should the public or anyone else want to see it. That is consistent with what we did for the PUD transmission line when we were concerned about, or trying to respond to the concerns that, you know, the agricultural community and other landowners raised during that review process. It can certainly be reworded if it needs to be, if you feel like it's outside of the
I think if staff is, you know, I mean, staff is fine with the way it's worded and feel that the county is protected and not being held responsible for that, I'm fine with it.
Right, yeah, so basically it's, you know, there should be a management plan developed for measuring and monitoring project effects, both positive and negative, and that the plan shall include actions to be taken. And I would say here, by, instead of TNC, I would say the applicant/property owner, if project results in unintended consequences, specifically increased flooding to adjacent landowners. But it doesn't say that the county would enforce. I don't think we can.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. You're muted, Commissioner Roberts.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question, if I may. So I'll just plunge ahead. Sarah, does the project management plan, given this collaborative process that we're talking about, also sort of include, or is it understood that this management plan will include like joint on-site inspections of the subject phenomenon, in addition to some of the other things that have been talked about, like an annual meeting or the like? Because my recollection of the testimony was that some of the adjacent property owners said, come out here and take a look. Mm-hmm. And that seems like a fair request to me.
So, thank you, Commissioner Roberts. So perhaps adding language that would, well, I guess part of it for staff is trying to find that balance and that space of, you know, trying to implement those collaborative discussions and some sort of commitment as reflected in the conditions of approval, but still giving all parties some flexibility to work together. I hope they continue to do so, as the applicants have captured in their final written testimony. I'm just not sure how we provide them all the space to work through that and come up with a plan, and whether it's more important for us to have a copy of that plan, or be more specific in what should be in it.
I understand. I guess as an old modeler, I always like to have ground truthing of the analysis that I've done. Mm-hmm. So I guess I would encourage, maybe not require, but encourage the modeler folks to actually go out on the ground during these unusual circumstances to test their analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, this is Guy Seaver for the record again. To follow up on Mark's question, and it seemed to be a concern of the adjacent property owner, and I know that there might be concern of other property owners, but what we heard was that there was no agreement yet, and I'm not even sure who we know that the applicant is on one side of any agreement. Who is on the other side? Is the creamery the other party to that plan?
That is my understanding, is that the Creamery and the Tillamook Bay Flood Improvement District, both who
Right.
represent the majority of the landowners, if not all within the vicinity of this project, have been actively engaged in these conversations and at the table.
So would you consider that the conditions of approval that we have here that are being recommended by staff include a management plan and an agreement that is signed by all three parties?
Well, I really appreciate your thoughts on that and that direction, and I understand that thought process. I'm just not sure we can require that it be signed and agreed upon by all parties. Because if it's not, that creates a condition of approval knowingly that the applicants may not be able to meet.
Madam Chair?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Chad Allen for the record. I mean, I have personal experience with the process of restoration adjacent our properties. And Guy, that's exactly what we signed into, you know. Was that kind of an agreement for maintenance of the flood structures and ag drainage structures that were placed around our properties. And so, I've heard the word collaborative a few times here. It's unfortunate that this process was nothing close to collaborative. And otherwise, I think that those type of agreements would have no resistance to them. And so, unfortunately, that's not where this project lies, you know. So, we're going to dive into these conditions later, I'm assuming, because I had some input. I know this conversation's kind of taken off, but I don't know if it's appropriate time yet.
Whenever you are at that point in your deliberations.
I'd like to make sure that we have a lot of questions answered before we go into digging into the conditions and looking at that.
I have no more questions of Sarah.
Go ahead.
I don't think you said.
Oh, no more, I'm sorry. I guess I have a question, which is that in their response, the applicant on page 4 offers some things that they are committed to doing. Holding an annual, to summarize, holding an annual meeting with TCCA and TBFID and neighboring landowners, agreeing not to remove sediments that accumulate in the lower Stasek Slough, agreeing not to lower the dikes, I'm not going to read all the way through this, and agreeing to write a letter of support for TCCA's sponsored grant proposal to study the issue of bank stabilization. Since the applicant has offered that, and that's something in their control, would it be in any way appropriate for us to fold those into the conditions if they're not already covered in that specificity?
Madam Chair, yes, I think we could. I mean, especially since the applicant has already agreed to honor several of the requests, which I think then does take us steps closer towards that goal of that collaborative process. And perhaps it could be I could fold those into, when we get ready to talk about it, condition number 5, and just reference those specifically and reference this letter and the date.
Okay,
So something we can certainly talk about later if you'd like to.
all right, thank you. Commissioner Allen, go ahead.
Yeah, Chet Allen for the record. Maybe it's in here and I didn't read it, but do we know, I know that when they left at the last hearing that there was a desire that they were, the creamery was continuing to seek another opportunity to meet. Are we gonna have an opportunity in the rebuttal, because we still have a rebuttal, right? This is it? This is all done? Okay.
But Commissioner Allen, to your point, I have been in conversation with Casey Allen, who is here tonight representing the creamery, Casey Story, thank you. And it's a little informal. And they are continuing those conversations. So, and largely what they are talking about is reflected in the applicant's final testimony.
So in those conversations, would you be able to say whether or not the creamery and the adjacent landowners have come to some kind of agreement on these conditions that the Nature Conservancy is willing to continue to do?
It is my understanding that the 4 agreements that are outlined in the applicant's final testimony, page 4, the November 3rd letter, are reflective of what the creamery and the Nature Conservancy are agreeing to.
Are there any more questions of staff at this point?
I guess they got some more then. On number 5, the one thing, since we're trying to outline some of the important things in terms of the protection of adjacent agricultural uses, you have mentioned the floodwaters in there, but not ag drainage. And I was hopeful that we could capture that in that condition of approval in one form or another. Because ultimately, in these type of projects that are adjacent agricultural use, they're certainly long-term more at risk at creating a significant cost of increased farming practices by poor drainage, late planting, unable to harvest.
Chad, could you repeat? We're not hearing you.
Yeah, what I'm suggesting in condition of approval number 5, there's language in there about, fixing any increased flooding issues, but not any language in there that relates to dealing with any negative impacts on agricultural drainage. And that's for me, one of the most biggest challenges to try to mitigate when you have restoration projects like this that are adjacent agricultural lands, and that somebody's ability to farm their property early in the spring and in the fall sometimes can be negatively impacted by overly saturated soils and decreased yields and things related to that. And so, that's one thing that I know will definitely impact the increased cost of farming for these property owners there. We've already, through the modeling, in terms of both parties agreed to on capturing any negative impacts of the phase 1 of the project on the Dewar property, by reducing that low tide time period I think if I recall, it was about a foot that they weren't getting the benefit of drainage during the winter months. And so, I know we can't take that into account in approving or disapproving this Phase 2 project, but certainly any additional negative impacts in an area that is already extremely low in the floodplain for those property owners cannot be tolerated. It has to be, dealt with if it's shown that it's causing more harm. The margin of error there for that part of the property adjacent to this is very minimal, and an inch makes a huge difference. And operating a dairy operation, forage is the only thing that keeps dairies alive in this community. And so, if you have reduced yields because of those negative impacts of restoration projects adjacent to you, it's huge. I mean, it can kill your business. Because having land next to a project that, is at a scale much greater than this, I can certainly testify that our property drains better than it did before. And so you can have a relationship that, in these situations, that can be mutual beneficial.
Madam Chair, are we in discussion mode? I'd like to discuss what he was saying, but.
Yeah, are there any direct questions for staff? And I'm gonna reserve the right to ask questions of staff later on if we have to do that. But are there any questions for staff right now? Okay, if not,
So Madam Chair, I would also,
Thank you.
thank you. There are findings captured throughout the staff report, but for the record, I would say, just as Commissioner Allen talked about, findings and perhaps modifications to those draft conditions to meet the criteria that address substantial or significant increases in cost of farming or impacts to farming practices. I would strongly encourage the commission to think about also adding any additional findings that are not captured in the staff report that you feel are appropriate and necessary for your deliberation process.
thank you. Is there a comment on that from the commission? Or question? Okay. All right, then we are closed to that section and ready for discussion. Leading up to a motion at some point.
Chad, guys here for the record. So Chad, when you look at the 4 additional conditions that the applicant is willing to add, and as what we heard, that these are conditions that were somewhat negotiated, I guess, with the creamery and the district. Do you think those would have any impact on your concerns about flooding and drainage? A positive impact for the landowner? Not yet.
Well, Chad Allen for the record, I mean, we the assumption was, and that's why I asked Sarah was whether, her opinion was that this was something that at least the 3 of them, had participated in and came to some kind of conclusion about. It would have, I guess, it would have been interesting to have seen some additional testimony submitted by the property owner or by the creamery to be more specific in that instead of making some assumptions. But, you know,
Right.
it wasn't in there. I looked at it a couple of times thinking, Lord, I must be missing something. But, in the process of this application, that Nature Conservancy was respectful enough to pause and enter into that collaborative process. It certainly would have been a whole lot more pleasing to have seen that to be successful in dealing with the concerns and issues that the property owners raised at the last hearing, and we didn't hear that, and so that was unfortunate, you know. I think for me, as I admitted to previously, being extremely involved in this Senate Bill 1517, sort of the nature, the design of that concept was that when these projects matured to the point that they came to the Planning Commission, most of that steam would have been blown off, and there may have been some modifications in the design of the project that could have mitigated some of the concerns of the property owners. My biggest concern for them, is the ag drainage part of it. I'm probably less concerned about the surface flooding during high water events, because the negative impact of poor drainage is a whole lot long lasting, and so that part's been difficult for me, Guy, and so these are complicated issues for sure. I think there was components of the design in the Porter project and the removal of the wooden culvert that was going to help mitigate some of that drainage problems from the phase one. Of course, if we could look backwards and some of these things would have been captured in the original design of the whole thing, I think everybody would have probably got what they wanted, and there would have been additional restoration area in the community, and also the protection for the adjacent agriculture use. But that's kind of what pushed the drive for the pilot project in the first place, and so that's the struggles that I have. I mean, I think there's some parts in here that'll have some continuation and monitoring, and if a problem does arise, are they going to be willing to be up front and try to figure out how to solve it, or are they going to be more denying and finding this hydrologist to counteract this hydrologist and not take responsibility. So those are the things that I'm concerned about.
Well, it's a struggle that Guy Stephen, for the record, struggle that I'm had in reviewing this. I mean, I clearly see the conservation values presented by the applicant and verified by everybody, TEP and others, and I know the incredible value of estuaries for fish and wildlife habitat. And also in climate change. I mean, it's been shown about restored estuaries and carbon sequestration. But so there's no question about those values. the concern here is, and I know that the planning commission is not in a position to weigh those values versus the values of protecting lands above, I guess, upstream. I mean, it's an unusual situation where we have a development downstream. I mean, I've been involved in developments where we've affected, by opening up drainage in a way, by right-sizing culverts and other things, where we've had flooding downstream. And I guess in reading the criteria and seeing what our responsibilities are, looking at these agreements and knowing that we have no enforcement capability or responsibility here, and we're depending on the goodwill of the applicant and others involved, and all the parties involved, and it's hard struggling with this.
I want to ask a question of staff at this point. Proposed condition number 3 talks about the applicant property owner shall be responsible for restoring as nearly possible to its former condition any agricultural land and associated improvements that are damaged or otherwise disturbed during the construction process. Is there wiggle room in there for any of the concerns for ongoing liability? Or, I guess my question is, why is it only during construction?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sarah Absher for the record, because largely that is when so like for the PUD transmission line, again, we know that condition and that requirement was upheld through an appeal process. Going beyond that to try to anticipate what may be unintended or unknown impacts that we as the decision maker cannot quantify, but then would be required to enforce in the future, I'm just not sure we could get there. If I may though, I do have just a thought maybe to share to help. So going back to Commissioner Sievert and Commissioner Allen's comments, I think there's 3 tests here that have to be met. And I think the first test, largely with the conditional use review process for the estuary natural zone, the shoreland overlay zone, and then those development standards within 3.120 and 3.140, which are your estuary development standards, requirements, etc. That is the test of, is there a benefit? You're looking at, you're assessing impacts both from an environmental standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a social standpoint, etc. And as stated during the last hearing, this doesn't have to be this large quantitative report and analysis. The intent is that it should be able to be easily done without a lot of difficulty or technical evaluation. But so one prong of that 3-part test is, does this project meet, in your opinion, those benefits and those values? Is it consistent with the comprehensive plan? Does it meet the intent of those active estuarine resource components that can be permitted because they're consistent with those estuary management units? The second piece is does this project result in significant impacts to the cost of farming or farming practices, right? So you have to hit both marks, the estuarine benefits, the environmental benefits, and while making sure, in your opinion, it does not result in significant impacts to practices and costs. And then the third one, which is probably the easiest of the 3, are the development permit criteria for development in floodplains. So the fill is not in a coastal high hazard area? Are there alternative upland locations? And probably in relation to this project specifically, when you start talking about altering or diverting the flow of flood water. So just maybe, I don't know if that helps kind of, put the conversation into some compartmentalized pieces for findings to base your decision on.
Thank you. Comments?
Gail, this is Mark.
Go ahead.
So, Gail, I was looking at that third condition of approval as well as you were, and I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice if we could just change that word during to due to? And I think we would address some of the concerns that Chad was bringing to our attention. However, I'm concerned that Sarah is pointing out that that type of due to takes us into a very speculative area, or perhaps it takes us to the right place as far as it's something to be tested by the different parties to this agreement. I'll just offer that.
Well, I got a good question for staff.
Go ahead, Commissioner Allen.
Okay. I guess I'm a little bit confused how 3 even relates into this. You had some mention about the PUD transmission line about that. I understand the PUD transmission line in terms of them going on the active agricultural land and being required to fix any damage they have when they put poles in and stuff, in and out. But all this work's gonna be done on Nature Conservancy's property as part of a restoration project. That's, I mean, it's still zone, exclusive farming zone, but, for parts of it, but it's not gonna be agricultural anyway, so how does it relate? Because it's not, I don't think that this is referencing neighbor's property.
So that's Sarah Absher for the record. So that's a great point. I was not sure, so that's why they're draft. I was not sure if you would feel like that condition would be appropriate, given, I'm not entirely sure where all they may be traversing outside of the boundaries of their own property to do some of this work. But if you feel that it is not needed, then it can certainly come out.
Well, I just don't think it's related to adjacent agricultural lands. That's, I mean, they're not likely gonna be going over other people's property to get to theirs. I think that's pretty landlocked in terms of the highway division there, I think in terms of the property boundaries, but I don't think that that's what we're talking about.
So during the construction process, though, if there are any activities that have a cause and effect that would result in damage of those adjacent properties, right? So we're not just talking about vehicular activity.
Well, then I think you'd have to reword it in terms of, holding them responsible for any damage during construction to adjacent agricultural practices or lands or whatever. I mean, if that's what you were trying to get to, it's not
Real clear.
in that particular one. I mean, it's definitely fitting for the PUD conditions of approval, but maybe not this one.
Well,
Quick
and
hazard insert here. Guy, could you mute your phone or microphone when you're not speaking? Thank you.
so in my thoughts, after continuing to look at these, Sarah Absher for the record, Yeah, my thoughts, honestly, after continuing to look at these, following, sharing with you last week, was also that, is it more appropriate to focus more on recommended condition of approval number 5, which ultimately could capture any of those concerns anyway, that are appropriate given the site location and the scope of project, or the project scope. Yeah.
Except that condition 5 talks about monitoring, and condition 3 talks about responsibility. And those aren't quite the same thing.
No, but, sorry, Madam Chair, if I may, just thinking about the actions to be taken if the project does result in.
Right.
Yeah, this is a very unique application. We have never done one of these before, so part of the, definitely the piece for staff was trying to figure out how to, help you craft conditions of approval for this project, because we haven't done this before.
Commissioner Allen, does the second sentence, the project management plan shall include actions to be taken by the Nature Conservancy if the project results in unintended consequences, especially increased flooding, does that not address your drainage issues? I don't know how we're defining flooding, as you say, an inch matters. Does it have to be
Well,
above ground to be flooding?
No, I'm just referencing groundwater, so
Right.
in terms of the water you can't see, right?
Okay, and
so-
I guess that's my question.
Yeah.
What's our definition of flooding? Does it have to be above ground to be flooding?
Well, most of the time, I would say, that would be the case.
Or you could just think about restructuring that sentence, something like, the project management plan shall include, I would say, mitigation actions to be taken by the applicant/property owner in response to impacts to adjacent active agricultural lands, such as increased flood risk and changes and drainage conditions that negatively impact agricultural activities, or something like that, or groundwater conditions. Which then hopefully if I am understanding correctly, the collaborative approach that the applicant and property owner continue to take with the agricultural community, that then would be naturally folded into their monitoring, their annual meetings, and those other pieces that they've already committed to. But I can continue to work on that, but I don't know if maybe changes in groundwater that negatively impact, if that's a better way of saying that,
Could be.
and increased flood risk. The thing though, I will say honestly, just thinking out loud, when we talk about increased flood risk, I think that the thing that's also important there is that largely in terms of the NFIP and FEMA, it's 2 structures, right? It's not necessarily 2 driveways. And so I think maybe that would need some more additional refinement as well. Just to be very clear that specifically when we talk about an increase in flood risk, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, most of the time, it's in your house, water.
It's structures.
Right.
It's increased flood risk to
If
structures.
you haven't had it in your garage and you got it in your garage now, you know, even though it's not in your living quarters, it's a huge deal, and so, but, you know, I don't know that, I mean, there was some testimony about some water in the barn and stuff, but, you know, I mean,
I'm
2000.
wondering, Sarah Guy Seaver for the record too, that, I think actually it's the FEMA regulations, my memory is that it's insured structures, not just structures. And I'm wondering, and we heard testimony about barn flooding, and I don't know if that was an insured barn, but, yeah, I'm not so sure we can, I mean, the whole drainage thing is difficult. Because the damages to the operations of the farm. But of course, one of the criteria is fits with, you know, that increases, and you wish that there was some, you know, our only real leverage here as a planning commission is to whether or not we approve or not approve of the application. And once we approve it, if we approve it, then all the other things, like you often say, Sarah, are up to are civil matters, and the county's has no responsibility. So then it goes to it would have been great if the Nature Conservancy and Creamery and the Drainage District or the other district would have come with a signed agreement that everybody's on board with the same, here's how we're going to handle this going into the future. And even though we wouldn't enforce that agreement, at least we know that it exists. So what we're being asked to do is approve this without any real legal agreement or signed agreement.
Yeah, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Commissioner Allen.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Chad Allen for the record. Yeah, Guy, I mean, that's the number one issue I've had with this entire application is that the very nature of Senate Bill 1517 was to bring the different parties together to work these things out, to have exactly what it is that you spoke of. And what makes it challenges is that the collaborative process, at least in the final application that we would have liked to have seen, failed. I think you heard testimony on, yeah, you know, we've been working on it, we did modeling, we did this, but it still seemed that, you know, not everybody was happy with it. Now, whether more time would have been allowed for them to figure it out, you know, potentially, but you have to have both parties willing to compromise and accept maybe certain risk or change design and give a little here to take, you know, that. And I don't know that worked in this process. So that's what really makes it challenging. For me, in the second phase of this restoration down there, it seemed to help mitigate some of the negative impacts from phase one. You know, that's kind of how I see this whole process down here. Phase one, phase two, it's in the exact same area. So one's going to complement the other in terms of its restoration value and its conservation benefits for salmon rearing areas, which is really, really important. But that's what makes it tough, you know. Because I know that there's negative impacts to the cost of farming on adjacent land use with having restoration projects that are built next to them that haven't been properly designed. And it's a real thing.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So, Sarah Absher for the record. So in this conversation, I did look to see where we were at with our timeline. Wondering if I could offer that, you know, maybe we give them a little bit more time to codify that agreement and bring it back. The 150-day process will end largely by the end of this calendar year. And if it is still necessary, to build in an appeal, time for an appeal hearing, which we're required to do, that puts us too close to the end of that time. And what would be safe would be to keep the conditions of approval general in nature, so that we can make sure that we are also, as a decision-making body, imposing appropriate conditions of approval that are clear and objective and we know can be met. But with that, perhaps limiting them to what has been agreed upon could be an option as well. What has been agreed upon that we know of thus far. You still have the standard conditions of approval that generally come with a floodplain development permit. We know that there are avenues for civil recourse if there are issues. And largely, and I don't know if it's more important to capture through the conditions of approval what we know has been agreed upon, which is consistent with the intent of the collaborative process, or try to, I don't want to say guess, but project what may be needed in the future.
So, Guy Siebert for the record, I have a couple of thoughts on that. One, the testimony we heard at the previous hearing from the landowner seemed to indicate that this collaborative process was not done in good faith. Mark alluded to it earlier about the applicant not taking an invitation to come during the winter season, high tide season or whatever, to see the flooding. I don't know, I wasn't there, I don't know if it was in good faith or not, but the perception, what we heard was at least one party's perception of what that process was. And perception is everything, and moving forward with the knowledge that at least one of the parties in this agreement that hasn't yet been agreed to, the process, feels like it's not in good faith. So that's a concern I have. Second concern is that, as we've said several times here, this is the first application we've had under 1517. And I know that our decisions aren't like the Supreme Court's and set precedent, but in a sense, this is a precedent as how we move forward. And if we vote to approve this application without the spirit, at least, if not the letter of the 1517, that there would be a collaborative agreement as to how this would happen, then what we're doing is make a decision really that goes against 1517 and the intent of 1517. And so if we approve one application that has no agreement, and I'm not saying that automatically opens the door, but it certainly doesn't say to any other applicant, hey, we're going to have to get something, we're going to have to agree with all parties, all stakeholders here before we move forward. I mean, there's no question about the conservation value of this project. That's why it's upsetting to me that we couldn't come to some kind of understanding, and at least, in my mind, understanding to compensate any loss of business or cost of business of the local property owner. But, I mean, that's not, I'm not there, I'm not part of it. But those are my concerns.
Go ahead, Commissioner Allen.
Yeah, Chad Allen for the record. Yeah, I really appreciate that, Guy, your feedback on that. And I agree 100% with everything you had to say. The Senate Bill 1517 had two pathways. One was to just steam right ahead and take it to the planning commission and go through whatever appealing of appeals and take it that way. Or enter a collaborative process, knowing that to be successful in your application, it's gonna be advantageous to you as the applicant to make sure that whatever comes out of that collaborative process is gonna be able to smoothly go through the process. I think that was the whole intent of doing that, and if they opened up the door to pursue that collaborative process, and everybody, the Creamery, Nature Conservancy, Michael Prince, Tillamook Bay Flood Improvement District, if they enter the door to be part of that, then they're entering into an agreement to be collaborative and to work to a solution that's successful. I mean, that's like the definition of an A+, I guess, in terms of going through that process, and that's not what happened. And I don't have a single doubt that it could have happened. Because I've been involved in it, and extremely more complicated. And so it's just, I guess I'm saddened that it wasn't successful, because I take a lot of responsibility the fact that it's a pilot project. And for this not to be successful in its first attempt through it is not happy for me, because it could have been.
Well, I guess I would, Gail Uzell for the record, I guess I would, even though I'm chair, put my 2 cents in here. I don't think I've ever been more disappointed to get a skinny packet. I don't look for skinny packets. I mean, I like skinny packets, but I wanted the final collaboration to be here, and it's not here. And I totally agree that that's what 1517 is all about. And the fact that there are some, those 4 items there, without everyone's buy-off on it, makes me very uncomfortable about how this didn't come to fruition. And it is the first one of these. And I would like to see Senate Bill 1517 work. And I don't feel like it worked the way it could work here.
Madam Chair, if I may. Sarah Absher for the record. So specifically, the Senate Bill 1517 project is for wetland restoration projects on farm zone properties. Does the Planning Commission feel like those 2 criteria can be met without the collaborative process unfolding the way the Commission hoped it would? Just to kind of help, with the, as we continue to move through the process, there are 2 specific criteria for restoration on farm zone properties. Unfortunately, those criteria do not require a consensual agreement. Do you feel that there's, I guess I would, ask the Commission, is there adequate evidence in the record that demonstrate those criteria are met?
Sarah Guy Stevens for the record. So one of the criteria speaks about, I'm paraphrasing here, damage or cost to neighboring property, increasing the cost. Do we feel that that is a possibility here? I think it is. And there an agreement as to how, I mean, the fact that we have to then consider it, one of the ways which we considered is if that particular increased cost to an adjacent business, how would that be compensated or mitigated? And that would, to my mind, that would have been part of the agreement of this collaborative process. So am I wrong in thinking that that's one of the criteria we're to consider?
Well, I think it's, Chad, on for the record, I think it, you know, in the conditional use permit for Arlington, it's on the burden of the applicant to show that they haven't created any cause of increase in farming practice, in cost of farming practices, and that's where the value of that collaborative process is, to engage with those property owners that are in active agriculture to prove to them that you know there's either going to be neutral impacts or some benefit, I guess. I mean, that would be the best case scenario, to show that these alternative uses on exclusive farm use zone can be conjoining. And the fact that collaborative process, in my opinion, failed, then I would say they didn't reach their burden of proof.
Madam Chair, would you like me to read those two criterion into the record?
Please.
Thank you. So this is section 6.060 of the Tillamook County Land Use Ordinance, and it's for wetlands restoration, enhancement, or creation on land subject to exclusive farm use zoning designation. So A, the use will not force a significant change in accepted farm or forest practices on surrounding lands devoted to farm or forest use. And B, the use will not significantly increase the cost of accepted farm or forest practices on surrounding lands devoted to farm or forest use. And that's on page 20 of the staff report. I do have those there.
So again, Guy Seaver, for the record, I think that there's evidence that those criteria are not met, and that's why we were hoping that there'd be a process in which the surrounding land farm use, what people would agree to, in this collaborative process. So we could, in fact, that even if there may be an impact, that impact is mitigated in some agreed way. And that's what we don't have. Sarah, let me ask, is there a time for an extension, for the applicant to ask for an extension?
So thank you, Commissioner Siebert. That's actually what I was counting those 150 days for. So should the Planning Commission choose to take a quick recess, I am happy to visit with the applicant to see if they would be interested in signing